Thank you. Is this on? I got the green light going? Alrighty, well, my name is David Abugaber-Bowman, and I'm doing my MPhil in Theoretical Applied Linguistics at Wolfson. Thank you. The title of my presentation is New Experimental Methods in Language Learning Research. So, when we were at Ambleside doing the orientation, I had to explain, oh, well, I do linguistics, but really this is the kind of stuff I want to do. If I were really to describe what my interests are, it's not just linguistics as a whole. It would also have something to do with psychology and the field of second language acquisition. And now there's some nice intersections between there. They each have sort of different names that they can go by or they could fit under potentially. But me, I'm just right in the middle. That's what I want to do between linguistics proper, the classroom-based nature of second language acquisition, and also the empirical groundedness of psychology. So for me, it's a really exciting field, and I think that there's lots of ways in which it can inform language policy, language teaching, and even just sort of the way we think about language and identity and boundaries and differences between cultures and that kind of thing. The way my presentation is going to go is just sort of a sample of different stuff that's been done mostly in the past decade and a half. But one thing I want to say is do make note of the years in which these papers have been published, because it's all very recent stuff, a lot of it. Anyway, starting right off, this is a classic example in linguistics. So look at English T, the T sounds in start versus tart. Right? So you notice this one's got this funny little H on it. So there's this little difference in the sound there, the T sounds there. And oftentimes, whenever you just talk to a native English speaker and ask them all, they say, oh, well, they're both T sounds, it's the same thing, so forth. How about you talk to a Korean speaker, take a word like ta, which means all or everything, or ta, which means to ride like a bicycle, and it also means for something to burn. Now, for a Korean speaker, those sounds are just as different from each other as D and T are to us, in terms of the potential they have to indicate a meaning-bearing distinction. Okay? So the question is, well, that's all fair and good when it's adults and they're native speakers and so forth. How do babies do when it comes to perceiving these sounds and perceiving the differences between them? What I'm describing for you now is what's called the head-turning protocol. The idea is that you take an infant between, from 9 months to 15 months of age, around there. Sit him or her on his or her mother's lap, and then you have two speakers on the side of the room. Each one will come out with some kind of noise or speech stream. And what you find is that these children, whenever they suddenly hear some interesting new change in what's coming out of the speakers, they'll get all excited by the novelty and look towards the speaker that's making the sound. Now, this picture is actually kind of inaccurate because normally they would blindfold the mother or the parent there to make sure that he or she isn't in any way influencing the experiment. But what they've been able to find using this head-turning protocol is that no matter what language you're surrounded by, when you're about 9, 10, 11 months old, you are able to perceive all of the different contrasts in speech sounds between languages. So, for example, going back to this pa versus ta in English that we think of as just one natural category, they're able to perceive that very easily. And so this has been done for Japanese L versus R, and for ta versus ta in Americans, and then a ton of other studies that have replicated this method. Moving right along, when you're talking about adults and looking to see where they're looking, it'd be kind of silly to sit them down on their mother's lap and have them looking at speakers and so forth. What you do instead is you take this nice hat and see where their eyes are looking at on a computer screen. Right? So originally this has been done mostly to look at reading. So this is some kind of Scandinavian text or something, and they have these interesting things you can make out just from the way their focus will leap around in the line of text. But what I'm interested in more is these new methods that they've been using, in which they will put different images on different sides of a screen and see where the participant in the experiment is looking. Right? So in this case, what I wanted to describe for you is a study that was done about 2 years ago, and it had to do with the difference between the way that Spanish speakers and non-native Spanish speakers, that's learners of Spanish, the way that they process the speech stream that's coming at them. Right? And I do want to emphasize, in this study, they were looking at very, very advanced speakers of Spanish, learners of Spanish, rather, like translators, and the best guys they could find around the Bay Area in San Francisco. Well, what they did is they showed them something like this. You got a butterfly on the left side of the screen, a toad on the right. And in the speech stream, you would say something like, look at the blank, right? And now their options in Spanish here are either la mariposa or el sapo. La mariposa being the butterfly, el sapo being the toad. But you can see here there's a difference in the grammatical gender of the article used to indicate some difference, right? So what they've been able to find here is that as soon as a native Spanish speaker hears la or el, he or she will look at the correct side of the screen. ¿Dónde está la mariposa? And they hear la and they say, oh, it's going to be that one. ¿Dónde está el sapo? And they look to the right immediately. However, non-native speakers of Spanish, and I do want to emphasize this is very advanced speakers of Spanish, they have to wait until they hear the actual word before they can look to the correct one, right? And so what this can mean for sort of language, practice in terms of teaching language is that, well, for one thing, it'd be kind of nice to slow down for the language learner because he or she can't tune in to the speech signal to automatically cut down by half the number of possible noun candidates that's coming up. If I'm I'm a native Spanish speaker, so purportedly if I hear la mariposa or la or el, I would imagine be expecting a masculine or feminine noun to come afterwards. But a non-native learner would have to wait until the actual word. This is just some detail that they get points taken off on the test for, or that they have to remember so they can sound fancy and native and highly proficient. But they can't tune in on it to help with their speech processing. Anyway, moving right along. Look at this. So in English, we call this a bubble, and that's a blister in English. I'm sure Andrea's over there. She's smiling if you can see them. In German, Blase is the word for either one of these two. So, for instance, just like in English, you use the same word bank to talk about either a financial institution or talk about the side of a river. In German, they use one word to denote both of these concepts. Okay? And now there's been some very interesting studies done here at Cambridge, actually by my advisor about 6 years ago, to do with the way that these differences between meaning and form and so forth match up when we talk about translating between languages. What they did is they took second language learners of English, basically German people who were learning English, and they would saw how they would react to sentences like the following, right? His shoes were uncomfortable due to a bubble. These are words that are presented in English, right? And now what you find is that native English speakers, they would be as quick to recognize this as nonsense or anomalous as I like my coffee with cream and dog, or some other kind of funny sentence, right? Well, as it turns out, German speakers take a little bit longer. They do a double take when they see this, because this meaning of bubble is also activated when they see his shoes are uncomfortable due to a bubble. And so all of our friends who do literature and discourse analysis and who talk about translating between languages and all of the beauty and so forth behind it, these guys in more literature type fields, they're really onto something when it comes to this, the interesting thing about translating between the two, because these concepts are activated, as it has been shown empirically here. Just in case you're wondering, the way they did this experiment was just by flashing the sentences on the screen at them and then seeing how they respond to buttons. But the thing is, we can do much better than that, right? Rather than having to indirectly gauge how language works as a system by somebody's conscious response to stimulus, we can go one step further, cut out the middleman, as it were, and just look directly at the brain. So for about the past decade and a half, they've started doing more MRI and neuroimaging type studies to do with language processing. This is from 1997. And what you're looking at here is a slice of a brain of a second language learner of French. So this is probably an American or some other native English speaker who learned French later in his or her life. And so what you see is you have some yellow bits and some red bits that are activated. And what you find is that whenever English sentences are being processed, the red stuff lights up. And whenever French, which is the second language, whenever that's being activated, it's a yellow stuff. So there's some spatial separation in the brain. Now, the thing is, just to note, with early bilinguals, you don't get this. So if somebody grew up, for instance, in an English and French bilingual household, and both of those languages are the native languages, then those two regions overlap, because somehow both are being processed as native languages. Now, when I was interviewing for the Gates the scholarship, the very scary interviewer man asked me, well, with neurology, isn't that just about putting people in a tube and seeing what lights up, when you give them certain stimuli? And the thing is, in the case of fMRI, actually, that is kind of the case because it's such a slow sort of method. I don't know too much about it myself, but as I understand it, they look at blood flow in the brain and how different regions are activated and so forth. But it's all kind of on a slow response. You're not looking at the neurons directly as they're actually processing. For that, you need ERPs, right? So these are event-related potentials. The idea is that you take a speaker, put this funny sort of cap on him or on her, and then see how he or she reacts to different language stimuli, right? So, you know, generally the way that these experiments would look is you take your group of native learners, or native speakers rather, and then learners of the second language, and then see how the negativity or positivity reacts. Now, the critical difference is this is on the scale of milliseconds. So as opposed to fMRI, where you activate something and difference in blood flow or whatever doesn't show up until a few seconds afterwards. In this case, you're looking at it basically before even conscious reflection, conscious awareness of the language being processed can take place. Now let me sort of walk you through some studies that have been done with ERPs and EEGs. This is EEG. Just a little note about the terminology. ERPs encompass both EEG, which is this, and also MEG, which uses a less invasive procedure. But it's basically looking at the same underlying physical phenomena. Anyway, so to go on with sort of a description of ERPs and how you can use them, there's something called an N400 response to certain word errors. N400 because it occurs 400 milliseconds after the stimulus, and N because it's a negativity. So basically, N400 means that 400 milliseconds after some funny stimulus, you get a spike in negativity. N400s are elicited in response to word errors. So if I say, I take my coffee with cream and dog, you're like, well, that doesn't really quite make sense. I don't think you've got the right word there. Something's going on. And instead of getting this kind of a waveform, there's a spike in negativity, and so you get this sort of dotted line. Just one little thing, there's this annoying thing about ERP research that negative is up on these charts, so it can be a little bit disorienting at times to read. But there's the N400. I take my coffee with cream and dog. As opposed to the N400, you get the P600, which is a spike in positivity 600 milliseconds after a grammatical error. So here's an example of a kind of stimulus that will elicit a P600. The cat will eating the food. Well, it's the right word, but it's not really done the right way. There's something about the grammar or the integration with the rest of the sentence that doesn't go. Here's a P600. You get 600 milliseconds after the stimulus, a spike in positivity. Very annoyingly, that positivity is represented as a lower ERP response on these things. That really does get to me. Anyway, so how can you use these to look at language learning? Well, say you take some English native speaker who is learning German, and you present to this person such a sentence. Ich wohne in Berlin, or ich wohnt in Berlin, right? And this translates pretty much to I live in Berlin or I lives in Berlin. So the question is, well, if you give them this kind of mistake, what kind of response would you expect to be elicited? Well, this looks like that kind of response. It's a grammatical error, not a word error. He's not saying I dog in Berlin, I don't know. But so as it goes down, well, these in 2014, Darren Tanner, who's now at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in collaboration with Lee Osterhout, who's in Seattle at the University of Washington, and some other guys in the middle of rural Pennsylvania. What they did is they showed these kinds of sentences to learners of German. They found that first-year German students, so these are beginner learners, show an N400 response. So that's like a word error response. But the third-year learners, who are a little bit more advanced, show a P600 response, just like a native speaker would show in response to such a violation. Now, how could you interpret this, right? The idea would be, the way I sort of see it is, the first-year students, they're learning wohne and wohnt, these differently conjugated verbs, as separate words that they have to remember. As separate little combinations of phonemes, certain little sounds with some kind of meaning they should attach, right? And so you can sort of think of this analogy as, you know, imagine like there are books on your bookshelf, right? So you got wohne and wohnt, and sometimes you need this book and sometimes you need that book. And it just happens to be that they see, when they're presented with these erroneous sentences, they see, no, that doesn't look like it's quite the right one. So the N400 is elicited because, it's not the right word. It's something completely separate. In terms of the P600 response, where you can think, well, they've got their words together, and somehow it seems like they know the relationship between vorne and vont, and have sort of more integrated how it fits into the rest of the sentence. And so just like a native speaker, they're able to see, well, it's a normal word, and in terms of its meaning and so forth, it fits into that context, but it's just not conjugated the same way. Okay? Interestingly enough, in this, these same guys, they found this gender difference in the ERP response, and they found that women or female language learners, second language learners, tend to show more P600 response, just like a native speaker. And this is actually consistent with a lot of findings in the second language acquisition literature that women do tend to pick up foreign languages more quickly than men do. But now you can show this empirically, so it's kind of interesting. Talking about the P600 response, that's the response to grammatical errors. They've done some studies, and they show that when you're processing speech that has a foreign accent, you don't elicit a P600 response. So, for instance, in 2012, Hanu Likova and some other guys, they did this stuff with Dutch that was either accented or not. It sounded like it was foreign, non-native Dutch, or it sounded like beautiful, newscaster standard Dutch. And what they found is they added this kind of gender agreement to these sentences. So in one condition, kind of like in Spanish, with the example I showed you before, it has the right article. In the other condition, it has the wrong article. When the speech stimulus sounds like a native speaker, you'll elicit a P600 response when you get a grammatical violation. But when somebody gets used to hearing a foreign accent, and that foreign accent has some funny grammatical mistake, so to speak, in it, their brain will not show any kind of grammatical violation in response to it in the same way. And sort of the idea here is, well, maybe they're processing the speech stream differently or so forth. There's lots of ways you can sort of interpret it. But my take on it when I first read about this paper was, well, look at it this way. We come from this long tradition of dictionaries and received pronunciation and high school English classes where they tell you where to put in a comma and when to do this and when to do that. But if you find that somebody's supposedly non-native speech can be processed just as easily as native-sounding speech, then I think in some sense there's some dialogue or the ball gets rolling on some kind of talk or debate about what language correctness means. And especially in the past couple of decades, people talk about world Englishes and so forth, and to whom does the language belong, who's a native speaker, that kind of thing. And so this I think starts kind of complicating the story there, because there is some difference in grammatical processing. Anyway, I just want to finish up with what my personal research interest would be, and now as I'm looking at PhD programs, sort of what I want to get into is this case of multilingualism where the two languages are very similar. Now, there's the funny thing about Italian specifically that has me interested in it, and it's that Italian allows for this sort of more complicated processing than English does in certain ways. So let me show you an example. In English, or just in linguistics in general, there's something called a WH island, where a sentence gets kind of so complicated and you start embedding so much structure in it that you can't quite process it the same way. So try this on for size, huh? Your brother, to whom I wonder what stories they told, was really worried. A lot of speakers, I've looked at the sentence, so many times now that I'm quite used to it, but I think maybe to some of you guys, that wouldn't really be something, if somebody said that in real conversation, you kind of do a double take and say, what do they mean? Your brother, to whom I wonder what stories they told, was really worried. And there's lots of other examples, so I could have chosen more unacceptable ones. So anyway, but what my old professor did, John Sprouse, he looked at all these WH islands type sentences in English and in Italian, and he sent out these sorts of Likert scales online. What they do is they show the sentence to people and they say, how good is it? How bad is it? Is it kind of okay? Is it whatever? Getting people's ratings on it. What they found was, they did it on the one hand with native English speakers in the United States, and also with a bunch of students at an undergrad in Italy. And they found that, the Italian, in the case of Italian, they do allow a lot of these funny islands to occur. So this very same sentence that I had here just now, they showed it to Italian people and many other variations on it, and they found that it was relatively more acceptable. There are other examples where they had these funny WH islands due to some grammatical embeddedness and complexity that the Italians didn't accept, but here you do see a difference between, what you might call grammatical processing in Italian versus in English. And so for me, what I want to get into is say, well, if somebody's a Spanish native speaker and learning Italian takes less of a cognitive load than somebody who speaks a completely unrelated language, how would these WH island effects differ with this Spanish-Italian bilingual? And then would that be so different for instance, an English native speaker who learns Spanish and then Italian later on and so forth? So there's there's this wonderful opening or this sort of incision or something funny is going on where there's lots of work to be done and so forth. And for me personally, as somebody who spoke Spanish in the household growing up and has some experience studying Italian, it's a particularly interesting research topic. Anyway, that was just sort of a sampling of the different stuff they do in linguistics and the sort of stuff that I'm interested in. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Does anybody have a question?
Thank you for this. I was just wondering, it may not be directly connected to it, but in terms of how we process our second language, what do you think the implications of it will be in terms of writing, like creative writing in the second language? And how will this benefit or maybe skew the very writing?
It's great that you bring that up, because if I had had another 15 minutes to do this presentation, there's this wonderful language teacher / anthropologist, I guess you could call her. Her name is, I really do recommend you look her up. Her name is Claire Kramsch, Kramsch, Claire Kramsch. She's actually, she's German, but she teaches French in California, something like that. Or maybe she's French, but she teaches German in California. Anyway, the point is, she wrote this wonderful book called Language and Culture, and tons of articles all about how culture and the way that people are used to interacting can have some effect on the language classroom. So just to give you, just sort of a basic example, for instance, if you happen to find that the language in the language classroom has a lot to do with, I'm the teacher and I'm going to give you sentences in the imperative form to say, take out your notebooks, sharpen your pencils, write down what I'm saying right now. In that case, you get something about where on the one hand, this sort of social anthropology of the power relationships and who gets to speak and who's ordering whom and the levels of formality and so forth. Well, you have that on the one hand, but then also that means that the input, that the language input that the student gets from the teacher in the language classroom is going to be oriented more towards the imperative form. Do you see what I'm saying? So you start sort of seeing these connections where anthropology and culture and language, and I know, you asked about literature and so forth, but actually, if you really do look at Claire Kramsch's stuff, she's got some really beautiful stuff that she wrote about, kind of evaluating different exercises that have been done in the language classroom for more advanced speakers, and where she encourages people to sort of look at, to look at, basically, I guess I would say to take the teaching of culture in the language classroom and to take it one step up and to get students to be a little bit more critical about it beyond what they're used to. And that's actually, you get all these sorts of lovely effects because, for instance, as with the case with German blister and bubble and so forth, it's like those, when you're forced with these funny peculiarities from a second language, these funny peculiarities that any language has are brought out into the light. Do you see what I'm saying? So I'm sure there's lots of things. I'll give you an example. I had the good luck to spend some time in Brazil for a while, and I met some Brazilian friends. And in Brazilian Portuguese, the way they'll refer to each other, like saying, hey, what's up, man? Instead of man or dude or whatever, they'll say, cara, e aí, cara. It means face. Yo, what's up, face? How you doing, face? And so for then they don't do that in Mexico where I'm from, so I was like, oh, that's kind of like a really interesting way to like bring out just the physical. Like for me, it's kind of like saying, hey, glasses, come over here for a bit, So it's like really limiting it down to the sort of like appearance and sort of physical aspect of it. Anyway, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that when you look at foreign language instruction, there's a way that it's related that the peculiarities of a language, like this thing about face or bubble and blister and so forth, are brought out into light more sharply, I guess. People notice it more explicitly, or it's more funny to them than if it's just in an English language class and you happen to notice some little thing about some alliteration in some poem. So there's some great ways that culture, and language, and literature do play into language learning. And as I gave before, this example with the imperative form in Spanish, it really is necessary for language teaching to really take off. There's a reason I included SLA on the diagram there, and SLA does, at least in my thinking, include. Oh, well, that's quite unfortunate. So, does include, sort of these questions about culture and the way that language is actually used beyond just words and grammar. So, Claire Cramsh in California.
Any more questions?
Hi, David. I do language and neuroscience as well, and I've done fMRI and ERP. They're very hard to use together because they don't do the same thing. Do you plan to use both of them for different reasons, or do you want to just focus on ERP?
My idea, I'm sort of at the stage where I've never actually had experience, running ERP experiments myself, but I did take a class on the method, and that involved filtering some of the data. And even without having to get my own hands dirty and put the gel on the electrodes and be careful not to prick this poor participant on the scalp, I can see sort of how difficult the method it is to use. So that's why specifically I'm trying to look at labs that would be really, focus a lot on learning the methodology of it. So, unfortunately, I'm only here doing an MPhil. It would have been ideal if I could have come here and hit the ground running and really seen the way these systems work and so forth. But in terms of my own personal, what I want to do, here I want to do what's called a reading experiment, a timed reading experiment, where they flash one word at a time and the participant presses a space bar to go on to the next word. And though that's obviously very different from ERPs, it's still, you're still looking at phenomena where it's very much timed in terms of what comes when in the signal. So you're more at the sentence level. So I think that would give me a lot of the theoretical kind of groundwork I would need to do ERP later on. In terms of the actual really cool science-looking stuff with people and electrodes, sticking out of the heads and so forth, that's something I'm, not going to be able to learn until next year. MRI, the thing is, when I'm looking at programs, I'm not so much interested in learning about the brain. I'm just interested about language, and if the brain happens to be part of language, which clearly it is, as the one organ that, with the physical underpinnings or whatever, then so be it. So fMRI, if it's useful, yeah, sure, I'm all for it. But EEG, MEG, and then what's it called? Near field infrared spectroscopy. There's this other new thing that, Anyway, so all those methods are good.